This is a 17-year-old mother, and who went through all the things that she wasn't married, and the panic and the guilt and all those things. And you had you actually found your son as a boy,
yes,
after having surrendered the child for adoption.
Yes.
You found your baby. How old was he when you reunited?
Nearly 16.
16 years old. And what you've done is become a rather, you're a full-time person helping other people in similar circumstance find their...
Turned out like that. No, we aren't a search organization. We're strictly support.
Okay. You want to say that anybody who gave up their baby, maybe you can help and support and understand.
Absolutely.
There aren't too many questions you haven't heard.
Right.
There are lots of issues here, Miss Campbell, as I know.
Very complex.
It really is. First of all, do the adoptive parents want the birth parent to come into their lives when the child is 16 or 21 or 24? What are the rights of the adoptive parents, and how threatened will they be, and how much should we consult with them, and what are their rights? You'll give me that those are reasonable questions. Under what circumstances was the baby surrendered for adoption? And did the mother really know what she was doing? And who was medicated in the hospital in the OB room shortly after the birth of the baby, and what person with a lot of forms and whereases came in and asked her to sign that form? And was it voluntary? And 2 weeks later, how many mothers looked up and said, "Oh, I'm sorry I did that"? And how many fathers of the mothers who are having babies out of wedlock are saying, "Get rid of this kid, I don't want the people at the office to know this happened"? All that is happening, huh?
Yes.
And more.
And has always happened.
Yeah, okay. You're not here to say that if you have a baby and you don't want it, it's not okay to surrender it for adoption.
I do believe that the closed system in adoption, in and of itself, is exploitive. That does not mean that there should never be adoptions. It's just that it should be more open.
I think you also believe that if it weren't for cultural pressures and all the razzmatazz that surrounds, and the emotional guilt and the crying and the anger and the accusations, and should I marry the guy, shouldn't I, is he a bum, isn't he, what should I do? All of that is hardly the environment in which to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to live with your child as he grows up.
Hardly.
All right, let's see if we can't walk you through some rather complicated stories. Meet Mr. and Mrs. Rod Kelly. Let me try and see if I can start your story, okay? Not because I don't want you to tell it, but because we really have a time problem here. You've been married for?
9 years.
9 years. You have 3 children, or you had 3 children at a time when the service was going to send you overseas without your wife. Is that right?
That's right.
And you, being a good service type, responded to those orders. You couldn't take your wife, huh?
Right.
Okay, so you split from your wife because Uncle Sam wants you overseas, and you leave a wife and 3 children back here in the States. You are both also honest enough to say that at the time that you went overseas, your marriage was not exactly the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. You were having troubles like everybody else. Stress, huh?
Yes.
Okay. While your husband is gone overseas, you become pregnant by another man.
Yes.
He returns, and at the time that he returns from overseas, you're what, 2 months pregnant?
About 2 months pregnant.
Okay.
Yes.
So now you tell him, and we can only guess on what a terribly emotional moment that would be for both of you. You say, "I will return to you if you promise to give up the baby that you're now carrying."
That's right.
Okay. Now you say, after much dilemma and discussion and guilt and conflict, "Okay, I want to reconcile with my husband. I understand his feelings. You probably felt guilty and all those other things that people felt. All right." And you say, "Yes, it's a deal." Right?
Well, with reservation, yes.
Did you express to him your reservation?
No,
So you're not really telling everything to your husband.
no,
You're not being very verbal, and you're hiding a lot of your feelings.
yes.
Okay. Now take us. Now you're moving along in your pregnancy, and you're in your last trimester, I assume. And
Right.
without him knowing it, you're saying to yourself, "I can't give up this baby."
That's right.
And now you've got to what? You've got to somehow figure out how you're going to tell him that. Now you've got now you've got another guilt of breaking a promise, a deal, huh? With him.
Yes, just could not communicate. It had gotten to that point through the strain and
Okay.
just all of the stress from the 2 years prior.
I think at that point, her silence, to me, indicated concurrence with the decision, and my silence with her meant that I was adamant in my position and would not move.
Sure. All right.
Which wasn't the case, really.
Okay, but what were your feelings as your as you saw your wife become more and more pregnant by another man, you've got your own emotional problems to deal with here.
Right.
But apparently, as the pregnancy continued, what, you were having a little bit of a change in your head too?
Really, my attitudes were softening, although I wouldn't really admit it openly or say anything to her about it. Again, I thought that her silence was concurrence.
All right, let's get to the reason you're here and agreeing to share with us this painful experience. She goes to the hospital then? She goes into labor, goes to the hospital. Can you pick it up from there? Is that where we should pick it up?
No.
All right, well, tell us
with
what we have.
this social worker, I contacted the Department of Social Services in South Carolina because I had gotten to the point where I did not know what to do. And this was no longer a pregnancy, but my child. And I knew I could not give up my child. And I figured if I got a third party in there, a social worker, they would talk it out and everything would come out and it would be all right.
You could keep your baby and your husband would be okay. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Did you tell the social worker that?
Well, she came and went through her adoption lingo, and I remember sitting and waiting for her to mention the options and the alternatives, and there were none, nothing.
That this social worker would see that this child was delivered in a legal and appropriate way to an adoption agency for acquisition, that's a terrible word, by a loving couple, huh?
Yes, I even mentioned to her after waiting and getting no options, I said to her, don't you think it's unusual that a married couple with 3 children would want to give up a 4th child? And she said, no. She said, we usually get our babies from unwed mothers, but we take them from married couples too. It doesn't matter.
She thought that your husband was the father of this baby?
Yes.
And that you were just, you already had 3 and you didn't want the 4th?
Yes.
And if she suspected there was anything else, she probably didn't want to be nosy.
She did not want me to know all of my rights or options.
You think that she was sort of almost an advocate for the agency?
Oh, yes. She was doing her agency job.
And white babies, infants,
Our choice.
Our choice. In other words, there's a demand.
That's what she called it, choice. Choice baby.
She used that word.
Yes, like a fine cut of meat.
Not to mention the racism that's embodied
Yes.
in a comment like that.
Yes, and also I think I should mention that there was a paper that she was supposed to show to us, and she went through her little briefcase and could not find it. She didn't have it. So I asked her, what is it? I said, is it something that I can sign when I come home from the hospital? And she said, no, you have to sign it at the hospital while you're still in the hospital, so the Department of Social Services can take the baby from the hospital. I thought it was a hospital release from the hospital, not from me. And when I went into the hospital and had the baby, I also found out on the same day that the social worker came to have me sign the paper that my oldest child had cancer in her forehead, and the social worker knew about it.
I don't understand, excuse me, your oldest child didn't, did she?
Had cancer in
She
her
did?
forehead. Yes, and she had to have surgery. And they were aware of it, and she told me, don't worry about it, and she told me I had to hurry and sign the papers so that the notary public, the lady that was there in notary public, could go home.
Mm-hmm.
She got the bum's rush, is what it is.
Yeah. You feel that you're the victims of an agency anxious to get a baby to put out for adoption.
Yes.
Okay, all right, we got that. What's the situation with your oldest child?
She had the surgery, and fortunately there was no more cancer in her forehead. But she has to go back every 6 months for the next 5 years, and it fortunately wasn't as serious as but at the time, you know, they said
Sure.
cancer. And
Well, I can't imagine, boy, you have, I cannot imagine anybody handling all this stuff.
And come to find out, then the paper that I had signed, which I had the understanding was to be a hospital release for foster care, was a termination of parental rights.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so did you see your baby?
No,
Not at all.
no.
Okay, so you must have been a real emotional wreck when you came out of that hospital, huh?
Yes.
Okay, so then you decide, then you share your feelings. This must have been a very cathartic experience for both of you. And you both, and then, well, when did you finally get your own head together, Mr. Kelly?
It was a couple of weeks before we weren't communicating on this subject, even through the hospital experience. We weren't there together signing this paper. We're separated by distance. It was a couple of weeks before it really came to a head. And at that point in time, we were led to believe that, yeah, we can get that baby back like that for you.
In other words, you said, I know how you feel, honey, and I agree with you, let's get the baby. Is that right?
Right. She came to me with it. Again, you know, and that's when we first really communicated on the subject. What her feelings were, what would I say?
All right, and so you revealed to her that you had had a change in your stipulation, in your criteria for reconciliation. Okay.
Exactly.
So now what?
So now we've been fighting with the state.
Well, but you don't have your baby.
No, we don't.
You went to court,
Yes.
Right.
and what essentially did the court say?
The papers that we signed were legal and binding.
And your baby has been adopted by another
No, there's been no adoption.
The baby is in an agency? In a foster?
In what they call a pre-adoptive home. We were told by the social worker that it would be a foster home.
But your baby has not been legally adopted by
No.
two people?
No,
How old is your baby?
11 months.
And is it a girl?
Yes, Maggie.
Yeah, it has your, I see you have your picture there. We'll be happy to show that in just 1 second. Forgotten my question. Have you seen your baby?
Never.
And what is it, I don't understand why a court of law, if there is no other adoptive parental situation here, why would the state of which Carolina?
South Carolina.
South Carolina be so interested in ensuring that you don't get your baby back?
To protect the agency and to have the control.
To protect the agency from what?
They want to make sure that everyone that they have in the future now, they're testing the validity of that sheet of paper.
I see. If they let you have your baby, then...
Other people will want more rights.
Then there goes the neighborhood. You're not going to never be
Yeah.
able to trust anybody.
Right.
I see. I see. And you're on appeal now.
Right.
And yeah, I assume you're a service guy. You're probably not rolling in dough, huh? But you're going to continue this thing.
Yes, we are.
So somewhere in the state of South Carolina is your 11-month-old daughter
Yes.
that you have never seen, that the courts have deprived you not only of visitation, but of the opportunity to even reacquire, so to speak, as
Yes.
parents.
Yes. And what's interesting is the judge said that he did not feel that just because a person put their name on a piece of paper that they should be bound to that paper, but yet he did not return her.
The father of your child is not a factor in this, is it? Is he? I mean, legally speaking.
He has his own suit.
Yes, he is now.
So you're the lawyer representing the Kellys, is
Yes,
that right?
I am.
Tell me,
And the natural father of this child has now instituted a suit in South Carolina to challenge the custody of the child by the state on the theory that it's not in the best interest of the child for that child to remain in the custody of the state.
but he wants custody.
Yes, sir.
So there's 3 people claiming custody
Correct.
for this baby. Well, we understand that this raises more questions than we're going to have time to speak to, and there are other people with whom we'd like to speak. Here's the point, that as this is just one of the consequences of problem pregnancies. Not physical problems, but emotional and domestic problems. And the point that has to be made is that this is not necessarily isolated. And it's apparent that this problem also is not going to go away. And our hope is that by throwing some light on this or exploring the problems of other folks, maybe we can, maybe it is possible that we will avoid this circumstance in other places and with other people. and we hope you'll join us. Is the caller there? Hi.
Yes, I am. I'm an adoptive mother, and I have one question for the woman and her husband who were just talking. When you were in the hospital and you were looking at this form, why didn't you read it before they took the, you know, when you were signing legally? I'll tell you, if I would have had doubts in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy, I would have sought legal help before I would have signed any child away. I mean, you know, nobody, I would have gone out kicking and screaming out of that hospital before I left without that child. And I just would like to know why you didn't have legal help. I would have signed nothing in that hospital until I had someone look at it. My husband, somebody, even if I was incoherent, I couldn't sign anything unless I knew what I was signing.
Mrs. Kelly.
Well, first of all, you would have to have understood the state of mind I was in, and that I did not read the paper because I believed the social worker when she had told me that it would be a hospital release. And I was in no condition at the time to read a paper anyway.
But see, to me that doesn't make sense.
Isn't it possible for you to see that given the tremendous pressures that were on Mrs. Kelly, you know, you're asking her to act like a totally sober, unencumbered, non-distracted human being in an air-conditioned office after much thought. This is a woman who had a husband who may or may not stay with her, depending on her decision about her pregnancy, a woman whose marriage was jeopardized, a woman who felt terribly guilty, being intimate.
Who trusted authority.
Huh?
Who trusted authority, who believed in that social worker, that the social worker would not lie to her, who believed that that form was what the social worker had implied it was. It's really easy to say what one might do in a particular situation, but until one lives it, one cannot know.
If she called the agency asking for someone to come out to talk with her about adoption, why is it she expected that that woman would come out and then read her mind wanting to offer her options? You appear to be educated. Why not ask?
That woman was a counselor, and part of a counselor's duties is to ask questions.
But it's also part of the person seeking the services to ask, what else is there? If there were other options, why didn't she ask what they were? If she thought that there were options like counseling.
I did.
No, that's part of the counselor's job, to offer you counsel, not to influence your decision either way.
Why is that influencing your decision not to read your mind? Mrs. Kelly said that she would like for her and her husband to get counseling. She could have said that, and then that could have been offered to her. A counselor can't be all things to all people.
I was to the point, you have to understand, or try to understand, what I had been through 2 years prior to this, and the extreme amount of stress at the time. And I was seeking help the best way I could at the time.
I want to talk to the caller. You're an adoptive parent, caller?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I have very little time.
Yes.
But that motivates your interest in this too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Tell me why.
Because if...
If what? Well, we can't do anything about that. That's a phone... I mean, it's not the phone company's fault, but I think that... All right. Are you there? You probably can speak for her, Ms. Campbell. I mean, you've heard the statement that she probably would make before. Adoptive parents, in many instances, are very threatened by the possibility of militant birth parents coming after their, T-H-E-I-R in quotes, child. Mm-hmm. That's not so surprising, is it?
No, it's not surprising. It's a prevalent attitude.
But doesn't it have to be honored and given respect here? And aren't they entitled to be heard as much as anyone else?
It's really tragic that by overlooking the birth family as a family, and by social workers, some social workers thinking that this is a product which they can place, and therefore they do not give the birth family due respect and consideration and options and resources at their disposal, that another family has to be introduced into this situation, and that other family has the potential of being hurt. The resources should be made available before pre-adoptive placement so that other parties don't get hurt.
Right. And one other point should be made. and this is not to suggest this is the case, and I don't want to be libelous here, but we have to get this in. In many of these circumstances, money is involved.
Yes.
Profit is involved.
Yes.
Agency.
Careers, putting food on the tables of social workers' homes is involved. They're greatly invested. There's a vested interest.
Okay. We're really running long. We have other people we want to talk to, and I promise we're going to do that finally in just a moment.
Yes.
You wanted to say what?
I am a social worker, and I've worked for several, one in particular, adoption agencies. And a point that needs to be made here is that we are not allowed under any circumstances to give alternative information, and we're strongly encouraged not to do so. If we don't find babies to be placed, we don't get paid. And the one thing that I wanted to bring up here is that in 3 separate instances, I counseled young unmarried women on how they could keep their babies, because I sincerely felt that it was in their best interest and the babies to do so. And I was fired from my job for doing that.
I think the applause is to approve of her shedding light on this, huh? Okay, you're not applauding the practice. All right, your point is then that there is a prejudice on the part of the people from agencies who are counseling, quote unquote, the troubled pregnant mother.
Well, one thing you should understand, it's not a prejudice, it's a business. They have to place those babies to stay in business. We work for the agency, not for the birth mothers.
Yeah.
We are only allowed to place those babies, and we are only allowed to counsel them to do so.
But I thought an agency was supposed to be a non-profit, social, helpful organization.
That is a laugh, because I know of many, many cases where quote-unquote donations were necessitation or a necessity for the adoptive parents to obtain those babies, as much as $5,000 to $10,000 donations.
To the agency.
To the agency.
Charity, and then you get a baby.
That's right.
Probably a white baby.
And they have to sign a paper saying it's a donation and it's of their free will. But without it, they will not get a baby.
Okay, hang on with us a second, Lee.
I would love to commend her for her courage in telling the truth.
Well, what are you doing now?
Nothing. I have been more or less blackballed for what I have done as far as counseling girls not to, in their options in this. And I've applied many places for jobs and am not going to get one. I'm convinced of that, because I refuse to be a part of a system that is so one-sided.
Yeah. Hang on a second. Don't leave us, all right?
Okay.
Meet Linda Scrivens. Miss Scrivens, at age 28, gave birth to a child. You were not married.
That's right.
Was there anything at all salvageable about the relationship with the guy?
No, none.
Okay, so you weren't interested in marriage, and apparently
No.
neither was he, so that's not an issue here.
He was married. He still is at the time.
Oh, okay. So what did he do? Say, I'm out of this? Or,
Yes.
So you're on your
Right.
own, pregnant?
Yes,
Okay.
and very scared and confused.
And you're single? Mm-hmm. Okay. What happened?
I removed myself from my hometown so it wouldn't be a scandal, and I went to a reputable state licensed agency where it's also a residential home for pregnant women in trouble. So I lived there, and I was I really was unsure about what would happen. The counseling I got there was limited to maybe 1 hour per week, which I didn't feel helpful at all in solving my problem. So, but as my pregnancy continued, I more and more grew to love my child, and yet I was growing in my emotional turmoil too, because I was still in hiding from my home community. They didn't even know.
Did your folks know?
Yes, they did.
But you didn't want what, the neighbors and all the rest?
Yeah, I was kind of caught up into that without admitting it to myself, but that was part of it.
How long ago was this, Linda?
A little over 1.5 years ago, I delivered.
Okay,
My
so
son is 21 months, and I won custody. I fought. I must say, if it hadn't been for Phil Donahue, I wouldn't have known that I had a chance to fight.
Well, I'm very pleased to be a part of this happy ending. I'm not sure how I was, though.
Well, it was a week after I signed
You better tell us the whole story here.
Yeah.
Now, so now you go to the hospital.
Right.
Yeah.
I went to the hospital, and I left the hospital without my son. He went to a foster home sponsored by this agency. So I went back home, and that very night, I just made up my mind that I was going to keep my son, that I just couldn't leave him with anybody else. So I called the agency, and the director said that she would give me that they could provide 2 weeks of foster care while I figured out where I would live and how I would survive. And in that time, I went to seek aid, and it was just, they told me that I would have to name the father in order to get aid, which I wasn't willing to do. That was part of my emotional problem. And day by day, I just fell apart. And the agency did me a favor, quote unquote, by extending foster care for 1 more week, giving me this deadline to just do something before this last week is up.
Okay, you had signed something, huh?
I didn't sign anything.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Okay.
He was my son.
Okay. So now the agency has your
In
baby, but there's no papers on this.
No.
All right. Sounds to me like this is the kind of thing that lawyers love, because it sounds easy.
Well, they had the family that wanted to adopt him had been chosen. They were just waiting for a piece of paper to be signed.
Oh, I see.
So the director extended the foster care 1 more week, but that didn't really help me because I was emotionally falling apart for other reasons too, concerning the father at this time.
Sure.
It's very complex. So on the day of the deadline, I was just still out of desperation. I just said, okay, I just don't know what to do. I can't handle this problem.
Take
so
the
I went
baby.
to court. Yeah, I went to court and signed papers.
Surrendering your baby.
Surrendering. But in the meantime, my counselor knew all of the problems I had emotionally and everything. She did not offer me any supportive counseling as far as, you know, don't worry, you know, we'll help you out or anything. She also did not tell me that I had an option to more foster care. I could have had extended foster care, during which time I could have had more counseling.
With time running out, you signed away your baby, and then what?
I was very depressed is what happened. I just went home and I was despondent, and then one day I watched your show and I saw Lee speaking about birth parents, so I realized I wasn't the only one, and I phoned the CUB headquarters and I spoke with a woman there, and she said that if I felt unhappy about how I had been treated, which I really did, she said I could seek legal counsel, which I did, and I won on the appeal.
You mean you lost in the lower court and appealed it?
Yes, I did.
Now, had your baby been in the hands of the adoptive
They put him in that home, the pre-adoptive home, which I personally did not feel was wise. I felt he should have remained in a neutral home until there had been a final decision, but he was with them for
So we
a
got the
while.
triple trauma then of
Yeah.
the parents thought they had a baby.
Which I felt was unnecessary. The adoption agency was in control of that factor.
Yeah.
like to have
Now,
a
this
backup.
point should be made. We have been here in this very studio
Yes.
with parents who adopted a baby,
Yes.
had the baby for 11 to 12 to 13 months, and these were nice people. I mean, really, you'd be proud to know or be related to the, and the brown shirts came from the court thing and took that baby away from them because the birth parent wanted the baby back. This is a nightmare.
There needs to be counseling and rights and offerings before such placement.
And she cried just as hard as you
Of course,
almost
she's
cried.
now like a birth parent. She now has the same syndrome of loss that a birth parent has subsequent to the surrender. I think it's important for Linda to also say that after she signed the surrender papers, she was back in that courthouse in 2 hours
Yes.
and asked them to tear them up, and they would not.
The
I
adoption
am
thing?
also...
Wouldn't tear what up?
Well, they would not tear up her surrender papers 2 hours after she signed them. They wanted
I
that
went
baby
right
for
back.
placement.
Oh, I see. I see. You're saying, wouldn't humanity move them to understand
2
the
hours
dilemma?
later, yes.
I assume you're not surprised, social worker.
Not at all. It happens all the time. There's another thing, too. After 30 days, if a mother has not signed papers, the agency does have the authority to go to court and still place the baby for adoption. And oftentimes that is a trick that the agencies will use to put off the signing and take the baby legally anyway.
Right. In other words, non-action on the part of the birth mother can automatically give control of the child to the agency.
Exactly, in most states.
We'll be,
And they will also tell the birth parent to stay away from the foster home because it'll only confuse the child and create bonds that might not be able to last, and that it would be hard for her.
we'll be back in just a moment. Was how old when your baby was born?
27.
You were 27 and single?
Yes.
And as is true with Linda, there was apparently you weren't going to marry the guy?
No.
And he was not making any claims on you or the baby?
No.
Okay. And what'd you have? What happened?
I had a very, very difficult labor. When I came out of delivery, I started to hemorrhage, and I was on heavy medication when I came home. I never wanted to release my son for adoption, but I think my upbringing, Catholic education, I was taught that children need two parents. And I started to begin to feel like I was being selfish, that wanting my child with me was a selfish attitude. The best thing for the baby would be to be placed in a home with two parents, to have a quote-unquote normal family life. When you go through that for very long, you start to get a little loony, you know. So by the time I had my son, I really didn't know what to do. When I came home from the hospital, I was on heavy medication. My social worker was pushing for adoption. When I signed the papers that I signed, under the conditions that I signed those papers, I can't understand how any attorney or judge in the country could consider that document legal and binding.
Where were you when you signed it?
I was at home, but my social worker, when she came to the door and saw me, she said, "I can't believe how horrible you look." And she knew all the stress I had gone under, the difficult labor and the medication and everything. Okay. And yet, she let me sign those papers.
So you went to court?
Oh, yes.
And?
I won, oddly enough, because of the testimony of my, excuse me, of my social worker. She testified against the agency.
Where was your baby how old was your baby when you finally obtained?
3 months old.
Three?
He was 3 months when I got him back.
And had he been placed in a foster home or had been in
A foster home. They had adoptive parents waiting, though.
But he never really did get to his adoptive parents.
Thank God.
Linda's baby did, even though that wasn't legally finalized. Wayne Newhouse is here. Are you 22 now, Wayne?
I'm 24.
Okay, you were 22 at the time your girlfriend became pregnant.
Yes.
Is that right? She was 17.
Yes.
Okay. What's the deal? And her parents said, what? You're not going to get married? Or she had to have her permission to marry you, did she not? She had to have their permission.
Parental permission. Well, when I was 22 and she was pregnant at 17, we went before her parents and asked if we could marry. And they opposed to the marriage, so the marriage never went through. And about 6 months later, her parents decided to sign for the marriage consent, but then she had decided to go into an unwed mother's home through the Catholic Social Service Bureau. So as time went on, she put the child up for adoption, and she called me on the phone and asked me if I would sign the papers. And I told her there was no way that if she would not bring the child home with me offering support, and I also warned the home before they even done this, I said, then I want my child surrendered to me. And they told me that fathers never had any rights to their children, and it went on like that. And so I went into a court battle that I began on my own. I was fighting for my son, and she come back to town, and we decided to get married after already placing the child. She wanted me to give up the custody case during the time that she married me, and when I refused, she left. So now she's pregnant with my second child.
Your child?
Yes.
So in other words, you have fathered a second child with her, but you're married but separated?
Well, I went into annulment proceedings, and the annulment was dismissed. I opposed to the annulment.
But in any event, you're not living together.
No.
But she's pregnant with your second baby.
Yes.
The first baby is where?
The first baby is in a home down on East 30th and Woodland in Cleveland. It's an adoption home run by the Charities. I won my case against the Catholic Diocese just recently, but they still hold him in their home till I go down to court February 24th.
So that you say one, it's not a fait accompli yet. You've got other...
No, it was remanded back down to the juvenile courts for further proceedings.
Okay, so you're still, all right, you're still trying to gain custody of your first baby with a wife from whom you are now estranged, who is pregnant with your second baby.
Yes.
What would you say to people who say, you know, Wayne, we appreciate very much the sincerity of your interest, but it really does, it appears on the surface as though you're not being very responsible. You have to let me ask that question, not because it's I don't want to be accusatory. I want to understand how you would respond to the people who would have that attitude.
Well, what I'd tell them is, is I accepted my son, not knowing whether it'd be a son or a daughter, because I warned the home 2 months in advance. When he came, I participated in child care classes through the Red Cross and received a certificate for child care and parenting. And I feel I'm very much capable of raising my boy on my own.
Yeah. And you probably figured the second pregnancy would help cement the marriage, huh? Oh, all right. Well, I don't mean to suggest, as we know, that often pregnancy becomes a political issue. It shouldn't, but it often does. Yes.
How could you feel a second pregnancy or anything might help because she didn't want the first one to begin with? Now you're going to be faced with almost the same problem. You yourself, were you mature enough to know, to be careful, you know, not that this would happen again?
Well,
I mean, do you feel that you'll be able to handle your son now?
oh yes, very much so. See, it's like the child that was born first when we decided to marry, that was given away for adoption. We had an understanding that we would fight for the child till we exhausted all legal aspects.
I thought you said your wife didn't want, she didn't want you to go with the
this is the thing.
custody
After we
suit.
married, I married her. And then after I married, supposedly wanting to fight for the child, to gain back custody of the child with me, she asked me to give up the case. And when I refused to give up the case, she left.
And then she got pregnant, and then
And
she's
she was
pregnant again.
pregnant in the midst of this.
Yes.
I'd like to go. Now with the second child, does she want the second child, or are you going to have to fight all over again to get the second one?
Well, I hope it's not going to be a fight, because, you know, I never believe in the child hurts the worst, not the parents. And, I mean, seeing the battle between the first one and now the second one, I would not imagine that it would be a battle between the second one. She knows that, being that it was born in wedlock, because the first one wasn't, that she would take the responsibility of the child.
So she's not interested in surrendering the second child?
No.
So, and you're reconciled to the possibility of her raising that baby and you visiting it?
I would never object to her having a child and raising the child, just as long as she raised the child as a loving mother would.
I'd like to know if money changed hands between any of these people in the social services.
In which case?
Any of them.
Yeah, was money involved?
No.
Not that we know of.
One thing I have to say that people don't realize, though, is the expense of legal courts, lawyers, and the expense of legal fees that you could be taking and putting to the child and raising it and loving it in your home. And instead, they're taking you to court after court after court.
Over here.
I wanted to ask the man in the blue suit why his feelings changed. Why did you want the baby?
Mr. Kelly.
It's kind of a hard question. It's something that I just mellowed, I suppose, you know. To begin with, when we first got back together, I needed something, anything, to hang on to keep us together. And that was it. You know, yes, okay, that's a condition. Nothing saying I can't change my mind later.
Well,
Do you see what?
Yeah, well, I don't think you're necessarily I don't think it's a surprise that you would have some, perhaps less than immediate enthusiasm for raising the baby of another man.
Well,
In other words, I don't think you necessarily,
you know,
I don't think you should have to explain.
The child itself, you know, you're not going to sit there, or at least this is the way I feel, I'm not going to sit there and say, boy, you little brat, you know, you're not mine. You know, you don't work that, it just doesn't work that way. You know, I can't do that. The child is innocent. It did nothing. She did nothing.
We'll be back in just a moment.
Very uncomfortable about something, Phil. We've been very accusatory about agencies and caseworkers. I'm on both sides of the fence. I'm an adoptive mother and a former caseworker. I really feel bad that there hasn't been a caseworker here to defend herself in the case of the agency.
Very good point. Very good point. I thank you for making it. It is true that there are no caseworkers here. Yes, ma'am, or at least to my knowledge.
Well, how is it that the courts are supposed to be able to tell the difference? I just don't think that it's fair for all this, if someone all of a sudden changes their mind. Being pregnant is an emotional time anyway, and all of a sudden 2 weeks later she just changes her mind.
Except that we should examine the pressures and the interests that weigh on the pregnant woman at the time she is making this decision. That should...
That's true, I agree.
As a prospective adoptive parent, how could I find a good, reputable agency?
How do you know they're not going to come and get your baby after the... Yes. Lee Campbell, briefly.
Would you like to write to CUB, and I'll send you some addresses of some good reputable agencies with whom you might deal?
But essentially, you're looking for...
I would suggest Green, if you could go to Wisconsin, Catholic Social Services in Green Bay is wonderful.
I'd like to ask the Kellys if they thought of adopting their own child back. Would that be a legal outlet for their problem?
The child has already been placed with a pre-adoptive couple already.
So you wouldn't have any chance?
So you wouldn't have any chance. No, they can't claim... You can't put another adoption application on top of an
Not for the same child.
Did you sign the papers before the baby was born or after the baby was born?
Who?
Me?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, the first couple.
Say how many hours?
The first couple. Did they sign the papers before the baby or after?
I signed the papers, which I thought was a hospital release for temporary foster care, 16 hours after my child was born.
I'd like to ask Lee a question. You mentioned in your opening statement that you favored open adoption laws. Could you explain that?
That's a process wherein the birth parents and the adoptive parents meet prior to placement and have an understanding and empathy for each other's contribution to the child's life.
I'd like to direct this mainly at Lee. We've heard all the cases, all the sides of the parents and the turmoil that they've gone through. What about these children? Are they now rebelling against the parents?
I think that the mothers could probably best answer that question. I understand that their children have made a wonderful adjustment and are doing really well.
But your question suggests that maybe the kids are going to get emotionally fouled up.
What I want to say is, you know, one of my, say for instance, I'm the child, and I said, well, why did you give me away? Here I am, 16 years old. I've been with Mr. and Mrs. X all this time. They've done great wonders for me, and now all of a sudden you come back into my life and tell me you're my mother, you're my father. You know, how am I supposed to deal with this? How am I supposed to handle that?
Oh, it's so complex. I know that we're at a...
Yes, yes. Well, why don't you give us just your own feelings based upon the reunions that CUB has affected?
Well, again, CUB doesn't affect reunions, but, you know, that happens. The child has bonds with the birth parents that are never erased. And what that does is just reconnect that. That doesn't erase the bonds which have followed since with the adoptive parents and with aunts and uncles and girlfriends and wives and that kind of thing. It's another bond which is reconnected. And it is not a detraction from existing bonds, but just a reconnection.
I'm an adoptive parent. Also have encouraged a girl who was a friend of mine, 25 years old, to keep her child because she wanted to keep the child. Is there a possibility that if we had more support from our own immediate family, we wouldn't have to go to the social workers?
Absolutely.
You have to wonder how many fathers, being male, maybe I can identify with that a little more. You have to wonder how many fathers who may or may not have been absolutely, exclusively faithful to their wives go absolutely crazy when they find out their own daughters are pregnant and won't hear of any kind of revelation because the boys down at the office will think he's a lousy father.
Sure, and the mothers who live vicariously through their daughters and hope that the daughters will go on for college and those other kinds of things then respond with, how could you do this to me?
Yes.
How could we find out if the Kellys get their baby back?
Yeah, you want to know whether... Well, we'll keep our eye on that, okay? And we'll be back in just a moment.
A written transcript of today's program, send $2.50 in check or money order to Donahue Transcripts, Box 2111, Cincinnati, Ohio 45201. Include the subject or the name of the guest with your request.
These parents wanted to show their picture. Who is that? We've got to see whose baby that is, Ronnie. Can we see who's holding that there? Oh, that's your baby that you're trying to... Let's see yours if we could. You have custody of your child. Yes. That's your baby. And the Kellys also have a photo. Is that right?
Yes, this is the...
How did you get the photo?
Through a lot of calling and begging.
But you've never seen this baby.
No.
Right?
And this is the only photo that they would send, and I just got it about a week ago and when I had asked for a current picture of her.
This must make it more painful for you.
tell me about
Pregnancy
it.
in any situation is difficult, but if everybody has to sympathize with these pregnant mothers that have given up their babies, then I'd be very hesitant to adopt if the courts can say, well, now we have to think about this poor lady.
They understand that. That's why they'd like to see.
As an adoptive parent, I would like to thank the parents of my own child right now for having the consideration of giving me fulfillment too.
Services provided and promotional fees paid by the following. Announcing a new world car.